Hi, I'm Ryan Schultz. In this short lecture, I'll be discussing the introduction of a revolutionary medical technology to early modern Japan and considering its impacts on Japanese society. That technology, very much on our minds these days, was vaccination. In this case, vaccination against smallpox. Let's get started. Like many stories of disease, this one begins in the context of the global imperialist ventures being undertaken by the powerful maritime states of the West in the mid to late 1850s. In the wake of the arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships to Tokyo Bay in 1853 and again in 1854, the Tokugawa shogunate, then the rulers of Japan, begrudgingly concluded a so-called Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the United States. Under the terms of the 1858 treaty, Japan opened numerous ports to foreign trade, reversing centuries of relative seclusion and isolation from the rest of the world, and especially from the broader West. Until this period of opening, triggered by Western force, Japan had maintained only a single trading port at Nagasaki, and the limited few who were authorized to come and go via that port were highly isolated from the rest of Japanese society. Of Western nations, only traders from the Netherlands were permitted to land at Nagasaki. In fact, the traders who landed on the artificial island of Dejima, just off Nagasaki's port, were essentially quarantined upon arrival. This quarantine was enforced not so much to prevent the spread of disease, however, as to prevent the spread of ideas, particularly ideas of Christianity. Like almost all quarantines, however, this one was imperfect, and critical ideas managed to slip out through discussions between foreign traders and interested Japanese scholars, and that included the exchange of a few precious books. Concepts of Western medicine, in particular, began to gain currency among a small group of Japanese physicians then operating in and around Nagasaki in the early years of Tokugawa Japan. As historian Ann Janetta notes, doctors were one of the few groups in Japanese society who had the freedom to look for practical solutions to their country's problems outside of Japan itself. This was in part because Japanese medicine had always, for the most part, been a product of foreign import. Chinese concepts of medicine had dominated the practice in Japan almost from its start, and local variations had been built on that Chinese base for centuries. However, Western medical ideas, especially those of surgery and interior anatomy, began to attract greater attention in Japan by the 1500s. Chinese medicine had long embraced a highly idealized view of the inner workings of the human body, and Japan had followed in that tradition. Yet, presented by the Dutch traders at Nagasaki with new, detailed Western concepts and illustrations of anatomy that were based on the dissection of cadavers, Japanese doctors began considering a new way of thinking about exactly what it was that made humans tick, and, from that basis, how human ailments could be healed. In order to learn more, several of these Japanese doctors took up the study and translation of the Dutch language, which enabled them to communicate with the traders who brought these books and, of course, to read them. So long as Japanese doctors focused on medical ideas and avoided political or religious ideas, the shogunate left them more or less alone for the time being to conduct these exchanges of knowledge. These Japanese specialists in so-called Dutch studies would become the fertile ground upon which the concept of vaccination would be able to grow. As Western imperialism gradually broke down the Tokugawa sanitary cordon and eventually opened the country wide to the spread of foreign people, foreign ideas, and all kinds of disease. Let us now turn briefly to a discussion of the leading antagonist in this story, our enemy, the virus Variola major, better known as smallpox. By the 19th century, smallpox was one of the deadliest and most proliferated human diseases in the world. It was endemic to the growing cities of the West, to colonial settlements all over the world, and to basically anywhere that human populations gathered. In populations that had long been exposed to smallpox, about 1 in 4 of those who caught the disease perished. To make matters worse, the rate was much deadlier for those populations who had never known it, such as the native peoples of North America, who were devastated when smallpox was brought to them by the West. Even in places like London, few counted their children until they had caught and survived a case of smallpox. Fortunately, exposure to this disease granted lifelong immunity, though it still often left grotesque, pockmarked scars from the fluid-filled blisters that covered those bodies that were ravaged by smallpox. The smallpox was not a new disease to East Asia by this time. It had been spreading long before Western imperialism had begun to take root in China and elsewhere. In fact, by the 16th century, some physicians in China had begun experimenting with a way to counter the disease, or at least to attempt to bring it under control and reduce the mortality rate. The concept behind the resulting technique likely emerged from simple folk practices of intentionally exposing children to mild cases of smallpox while they were healthy. This maximized their chance of survival while granting them lifelong immunity if they did survive. This is kind of like how many parents engage with chickenpox parties in the US, although the risk is much, much higher. In contrast to this kind of controlled, intentional exposure, the new technique sought to expose patients to only a particularly mild and actively weakened case of the disease. Known as variolation, the earliest known published description of the technique of intentional exposure to a mild case as a means of creating immunity is found in Chinese sources by 1549. Put simply, variolation meant that doctors collected live samples of the smallpox virus, though of course they didn't know they were collecting the virus. They waited for the virus to age and weaken but not die, which they based on intuition and experiment, essentially. And then they intentionally exposed their patient to this weakened virus. The exact techniques for doing this varied. There is some evidence that variolation in China took on a secretive, even patent medicine-like quality, with different doctors promising better results and lower mortality. Yet, by the 17th century, the process of variolation in China had largely standardized around collecting live smallpox scabs from a patient who had the disease, drying and storing them until the virus weakened, and then grinding the scabs to a powder and blowing it up the patient's nose, the patient being the person who's being exposed via variolation. Although this exposure to smallpox via variolation still had a mortality rate of around 1 to 2%, that's considerably better than the 25% chance of dying from a case of naturally transmitted, full-blown, full-power smallpox. As a result, variolation became an increasingly common practice in China, especially during the Qing dynasty, which took power in 1644. Variolation was especially common among the non-Chinese Manchu people who made up the new Qing ruling class. Variolation was rapidly adopted as a policy applied to Manchu statesmen and generals, but it did not spread widely throughout society, nor throughout the Han ethnic group that made up the majority of the Chinese population. Although some Chinese doctors who knew of the variolation technique did make their way to Japan prior to the heightened anti-foreign isolation of the Tokugawa regime, variolation really failed to catch on in Japan. We're not completely sure why. There's some evidence that intentional exposure to smallpox continued to be conducted as a folk practice in Japan, but institutionalized medical practice of variolation as a way to create immunity, as existed in China, never really took off in Japan. This is a bit odd. There was certainly a demand. After all, Japan had been the victim of one of the oldest recorded cases of a smallpox epidemic, which was dated to around 585 AD, and the disease had continued to circulate afterwards, surging into devastating epidemics periodically. One surviving report from the 1600s notes that between 30 and 70 people died of smallpox every day in the city of Nagasaki alone. Even in remote mountainous regions in Japan, one source suggested that 1 of every 5 children died of smallpox before reaching adulthood. As the number of fatalities and the frequency of small-scale smallpox epidemics continued to increase as Japan's growing urban population expanded, an interest in Chinese-style variolation began to grow at last. In 1793, the Dutch studies physician Ogata Shunsaku published a text titled The Need for Variolation. But his ideas don't seem to have yet spread far beyond his domain, at least not within his lifetime. Abroad, however, the way the world experienced and understood smallpox was about to change forever. In 1798, an Englishman named Edward Jenner published his wordily titled treatise, An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, a disease discovered in some of the western counties of England, particularly Gloucestershire, and known by the name of cowpox. In spite of this rather milquetoast title, what Jenner had found was nothing short of revolutionary. Cowpox was at the time a fairly common disease among cattle that occasionally spread from the animals to the humans who worked with them. The symptoms of cowpox in humans rarely exceeded a fever, though the actual pox, the marks, the blisters that occasionally formed on the skin of human bearers of the disease did have some small resemblance to smallpox. What Jenner discovered and then scientifically proved was that humans who were exposed to cowpox developed an immunity to not just cowpox, but also to the far more lethal smallpox. Jenner then bestowed cowpox with the dignity of a Latin name, which it had previously not had. That's the Variolae Vaccinae, which was derived from the Latin word for cow, vacca. Based on his observations, Jenner then performed the first vaccination, in which he intentionally infected a young boy with a cowpox sample taken from a dairymaid. When the boy was later exposed to smallpox on multiple occasions, no infection took hold. He was immune. By the end of 1798, Jenner had used variations of this technique to successfully immunize some 23 children against smallpox without ever exposing them to the actual disease. Interested physicians across England quickly picked up Jenner's methods and began testing them to great success. In a short time, the practice spread through Western Europe and to North America. The greatest challenge to this new method of vaccination, however, was the collection and spread of smallpox itself, especially as part of over-ocean travel. The collection and spread of cowpox. Cowpox had a limited shelf life once it was collected, and cattle actually weren't available everywhere in the world. Partly to overcome this, physicians began applying Jenner's technique of passaging, whereby viable samples of the cowpox virus were maintained through a chain of infection that began with a cow, but was then intentionally transitioned from a human to another human to another human at a measured pace in order to keep the virus active. For example, to bring cowpox from Spain to Central and South America, 22 boys were taken along on the journey, and the spread of cowpox between them was carefully and scientifically controlled in order to successfully keep the cowpox disease alive so that it could be transitioned into its vaccination role at its destination. Indeed, by the end of this particular journey in 1803, the vaccine had successfully been transmitted across the Atlantic. By 1805, a similar technique of passaging brought it to the Philippines and then to Macau, a Portuguese colony in China. Details of this technique were translated into Chinese by members of the British East India Company. A vaccination clinic was opened in Macau, and when a smallpox epidemic struck the Chinese treaty port city of Canton, today known as Guangdong, in 1806, many Chinese in the city eagerly made use of the services of the vaccination clinic to protect their children from the dreaded smallpox. The technique did not stray far from the treaty ports, however, and official interest in vaccination was muted in China for the moment. News of the new vaccination technique reached physicians in nearby Japan no later than 1803. but it would be several years before the news became a functional practice of vaccination. In 1817, the Dutch doctor Jan Kok Blomhoff began attempting to introduce Jenner's vaccine to the island. In 1821, he requested a shipment of cowpox material and lancets, but the initial inoculation attempts that Blomhoff made in Japan actually failed, reportedly due to issues of technique and problems with patient compliance. He tried again in 1822, but the smallpox vaccine that was brought on the second shipment had actually lost its viability in transit, unbeknownst to Blomhoff. In 1823, he enlisted the aid of two Japanese physicians, Minato Choan and Mima Junzo, both of whom had already been informed of Jenner's method through an 1802 translation of Jenner's inquiry into Dutch. They merely needed access to the raw material in order to actually test the process. It was a shame then that Blomhoff's samples had already lost their viability once again, and the experiment ended in failure. In 1823, Blomhoff's tenure in Nagasaki ended. Alongside his replacement arrived the influential German physician Philipp Franz von Siebold, who was dispatched on a scientific mission to Japan ordered by the Dutch King William I. Von Siebold quickly established connections with Japanese physicians who had been studying Western medicine through Dutch learning. But von Siebold's attempts to transmit a viable vaccine to Japan continued to suffer from transportation issues through to 1825, just as they had under Blomhoff. Nevertheless, von Siebold succeeded in spreading knowledge of the technique of vaccination. When von Siebold was arrested and deported from Japan in 1829 for attempting to smuggle a map out of Japan, which was a crime under the shogunate's laws at the time, his ideas had already developed into a small but dedicated following among Japanese physicians. These physicians continued to advocate for the importation of the smallpox vaccine into Japan, but their efforts faced growing political headwinds from an increasingly anti-foreign shogunate. In 1839, another attempt was made to bring a viable cowpox lymph sample, this time from the Dutch colony of Batavia, to Japan. It failed. Yet another try in 1848 met the same outcome. At last, in 1849, Dutch and Japanese physicians succeeded in organizing the delivery of a viable shipment of vaccine to Nagasaki, where they used it to vaccinate 3 children. One of the first children to be vaccinated was the son of a Japanese physician, Narabayashi Soken. Soken had worked for more than 30 years in support of the successful introduction of the smallpox vaccine to Japan, and by coincidence, his son's was the only vaccination of the 3 that actually succeeded. Through the arm-to-arm passaging method, his boy became the stem of a tree of vaccination that gradually spread throughout Nagasaki and then, with the domain lord's permission, throughout Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. Kyushu lords at the time were far less hostile to Western ideas than some of the leaders back north in the political capital at Edo. In fact, many Japanese lords in Kyushu were eager to have their sons and heirs vaccinated against deadly smallpox. Within a few weeks, the vaccine had spread from Nagasaki to other major Japanese cities as well, to Kyoto, to Osaka, to Fukui, and even to the capital at Edo itself, the political capital where the shogunate lived. Contrary to our modern image of vaccine traveling in a glass vial, however, in this case it often traveled in the form of live cowpox pustules born on the bodies of young children. Vaccine clinics were soon opened across Japan, and in spite of a national-level prohibition on the practice of so-called Dutch medicine that was put in place by the shogunate around this time, the practice of vaccination grew until some lords even began to call for the universal vaccination of all people in their domains. Each time smallpox struck in this period, the demonstrated immunity of the vaccinated became living proof of its effectiveness, which drove ever-increasing demand. Vaccination networks soon formed under the nose of the shogunate, which underscored its weakening power in the decades prior to the collapse of the Tokugawa. By the end of 1849, the vaccine had very likely been transmitted to every province of Japan in some form. The vaccine brought more than just immunization. Vaccination was a technology, and no technology can spread or function in a vacuum. With the success of Jennerian vaccination came a stunning ascent in the credibility of Western-style medicine as practiced in Japan, and this began to steadily displace Chinese-derived practices of medicine amongst influential physicians. A growing sense of the superiority of Western methods over Chinese ones was gathering in small but important pockets within Japanese society at the time, especially as the Tokugawa shogunate began looking increasingly ineffectual in the face of demonstrated Western military might. When Matthew Perry arrived in 1853, the foundation of Japan's old society was already beginning to crumble. The shogunate now needed men educated in Western ways and in Western languages. It needed them to negotiate with these foreign interlopers, and many of the Japanese men that they called upon to serve as these interlocutors were physicians from the Dutch studies tradition. Now imbued with both medical and political influence, they continued to advocate for the spread of vaccination. In 1857, the shogunate authorized the first centrally dispatched vaccination mission, and in 1858, it begrudgingly approved the construction of the first officially sanctioned vaccine clinic in Edo itself. Barely a decade later, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed due to internal political upheaval, and the new regime that came to power in its wake was far more ready to reckon with the influence, technology, and ideas of the West. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 thus inaugurated a period of vast change in Japan, and the area of vaccine policy was no exception. By 1875, the newly formed Central Sanitary Bureau of Japan had begun collecting official statistics on vaccination rates across society. In 1885, this vaccination census was further systematized, with every family now legally required to retain vaccination records. In the event of a smallpox outbreak, officials would search out unvaccinated children who may have encountered known active cases, and then refer those children for vaccination. Case numbers thus fell with growing vaccine availability and adoption of its use. The Japanese smallpox epidemic of 1886 saw 73,337 cases, while a similar outbreak just a few decades later in 1905 posted just 10,704 cases. In the years to follow, Japan would steadily transition from an importer of medical knowledge to an exporter, becoming one of the leading nations in the world in terms of public health practice and a center of medical research. Though popularity would remain high among common folk, Chinese-style medicine would nearly disappear from the politically driven national agenda of Meiji Japan. It was driven out of the official practice by the inheritors of the political power that was originally cultivated by the Dutch-educated physicians of the late Tokugawa era. As it grew into a global imperial power, Japan would soon take its medical knowledge abroad, exporting Western medicine and vaccine policy to the areas that it forcefully occupied in Korea, China, and throughout Southeast Asia. By the 1950s, smallpox was eradicated in Japan. What had begun as a curiosity among physicians in the trading town at Nagasaki had grown into one of humankind's most powerful weapons against diseases of all kind. As the Japanese case illustrates, the spread of vaccination from England to Europe to the entire world was by no means guaranteed. It took the dedicated effort of hundreds, perhaps thousands of individuals to ensure initial adoption. It had to overcome challenges of transportation, of backward laws, and of reticent first patients. And most of all, it took time. Today, with the risk of new pandemics and ever more dangerous diseases foremost in our minds, It is important to remember that the continued successful development and adoption of vaccines is never guaranteed. Public health and the challenges associated with it will only continue to grow in prominence as we advance forward into an ever more connected world. By the way, if you'd like to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out the list of texts in the video description below.